This is the introductory video of the invasion scenario, hypothetical invasion scenario, and this involves the south central sector of the entire invasion alone. All vehicles, units, equipment, and more will be described in much greater detail as the full scenario maps play out. This scenario begins on the 3rd of October in the south central sector of coalition operations. Preparations were underway for a key segment of the largest ever invasion in the history of the world, topping even Operation Barbarossa in sheer scope and scale of the ground and naval forces involved. Even slightly larger as well was the assembled air armada, and that relates to being larger than the aircraft involved in the initial invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, being Operation Barbarossa, as mentioned. Within only the South Central Invasion Corridor, as featured, the Sino-Russian coalition had assembled some 1,648,000 total troops, divided into both Trojan and external invasion forces. The Trojans beginning within the land, and the externals beginning from without the land. With the Trojan shock armies beginning on strategically purchased CCP regime-owned properties within America itself, and the external component forces beginning within Mexico, Cuba, Canada, Bahamas, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and the Panama Canal Zone. However, within the South Central Invasion Zone, as pictured, there were some 460,000 Trojans and 1,188,000 external forces out of the total number of 1,648,000 troops sitting within Mexico as it pertained to the externals, the 1,188,000 number. Also, as well, were PLAN Marines, or People's Liberation Army Navy Marines, in two different brigades as part of the external component, the 1st and 6th PLAN Marine Brigades, off the Texas coast, along with PLAN naval combat vessels and one supply ship. These consisted of 4 cruisers and 4 subs, comprising the naval combat vessels mentioned, off of the Texas coast alone being just one group, with many dozens of other naval vessels operating along both of the coasts within other invasion sectors. 26 different PLA group armies, their average size being roughly between 50 and 55,000 troops strong, with a scant few reinforced larger group armies as the exception, which haven't been reorganized as of the time of the invasion, such as the 59th Group Army, for example. These different group armies consisted of active duty and reserve forces, with the active duty components having gone through the most recent phase of reorganization, with many of the reserves only having gone through the first phase of reorganization, as the active duty group armies most of which consisted of combined arms brigades, whereas the second phase of reorganizations, which the reserves and only some of the active duty group armies hadn't yet have gone through, consisted of older divisions, brigades, and other such units. Some of these group armies, as mentioned, being active duty, with many more drawn from the huge ready reserve of the PLA, were comprised of some 5 million total troops out of the ready reserves, with over 2 million active duty troops. And of the ready reserve, 4.25 million out of the 5 million of the ready reserves were of the PLA ground forces, or also known as the Chinese Army. Also, within the central sector of the invasion were some 3 Russian combined arms armies, or roughly the Russian equivalent of a Chinese PLA group army, 2 Pakistani divisions, an Iranian brigade, and also even paramilitary formations as well, such as 8 different PAP brigades, 1 regiment, and 1 division from the PAP's 2nd Mobile Contingent. These subunits, these brigades and regiment and division, being from its 3rd and 4th Corps, respectively, coming out of the 2nd Mobile Contingent, and also an Iranian Pasdaran, or IRGC, regiment, attached to Russia's 2nd Combined Arms Army. One of the Trojan shock armies present within the central sector was reinforced with a Venezuelan brigade, a Nicaraguan battalion from the Foreign Expeditionary Army, a roughly 500,000 strong force spread throughout the land as part of the Sino-Russian coalition. Also, there were 12 paramilitary construction battalions from the Chinese National Construction Corps, and an equal number of national militia battalions of the Chinese National Militia paramilitary forces, acting as a sort of skeleton crew in Mexico and in the border area to manage Chinese/coalition Mexican bases and freshly conquered border areas in a few cases. These forces, these total forces, were well equipped with full complement of some 14,000 tanks, 23,000 infantry fighting vehicles, as well as 34,000 armor personnel carriers. Moreover, some 15,000 artillery howitzers, 6,000 rocket artillery projectors, 47,000 mortars, including the dual assault gun mortars, like the PLL-05, for example, and 65,000 short-range rocket projectors, an example of such being the Type 63, 130 millimeter short-range light artillery rocket projector. In terms of logistical vehicles and additional troop transport, was some nearly 200,000 total trucks, including many being armored plated, specifically with kits installed due to the anticipated nature of the combat, 20,000 MRAPs, and 18,000 additional specialty, including some armored, specialty vehicles. Some examples being armored engineering vehicles / bridge layers / demining vehicles, air defense artillery vehicles, anti-tank vehicles, artillery supply vehicles, command and control vehicles, radar and electronic warfare vehicles, and more. All of these aforementioned pieces of equipment came largely from China and also Russia and all the rest of the smaller allies combined together. And these were just the equipment pieces within the central sector of the map. Their assembled air armada consisted of 59 total squadrons of fighter and ground attack aircraft and 16 total strategic bomber squadrons, being an aggregate of 75 total combat aircraft squadrons when combining the fighter and ground attack categories of aircraft to the strategic bomber aircraft. China and Russia each contributing 21 fighter/ground attack squadrons, and Pakistan 5 fighter/ground attack squadrons, with Iran contributing 2 fighter/ground attack squadrons just in the central sector alone. Altogether, these squadrons combined were a grand total of 764 different combat aircraft. Present as well was a combination of 35 total refueling aircraft, 12 dedicated electronic warfare aircraft, and 40 transport aircraft allocated specifically just for the central invasion sector alone. 320 attack helicopters, coupled with 180 armed reconnaissance helicopters, comprised the total combat helicopter fleet for the coalition in the south central sector. This, along with another 280 transport/utility helicopters for troop and logistical transport, including for emergency medivacs of injured troops. China also had 3 brigades deployed of their strategic missile forces, all 3 from the Eastern Theater Command back in China, operating DF-21As, DF-15Bs and Cs, DF-17s with DF-ZF hypersonic glide warheads, with others as well, such as DF-2s, 3s, and 4s, brought out of storage and fitted with conventional munitions for use by these brigades, among others elsewhere in the invasion. These forces operating these missile systems were further allocated reserve battalions of such from China's large reserve forces belonging to the strategic missile forces to operate the older missile systems, such as the DF-2s, 3s, and 4s, which these systems were able to be either fired from TEL launching systems or transporter erector launchers, which were massive trucks, or were fired from specially constructed scaffolding similar to the North Korean missile program. Russia's 2nd Combined Arms Army's Rocket Brigade itself was equipped with Iskander tactical ballistic missiles as well as the Chinese missiles that were available for use in this sector of the invasion. Additionally in use were various air, sea, and land-fired cruise missiles, combined with the various ballistic missiles mentioned, constituted a grand total of 95,000 cruise and ballistic missiles throughout the entire invasion of just those 2 classes alone of missiles that were used throughout the whole country. 65,000 of these missiles alone being Chinese, and 25,000 others being Russian, and the remaining 5,000 being a mix of Iranian, North Korean, and Pakistani weapons of those 2 same categories. Prior to the invasion of America, for the previous 7 years, The Chinese rapidly expanded the production of ballistic and cruise missiles of all sizes and ranges, as also did Russia as well, with each nation adding thousands of ballistics and literal tens of thousands of cruise missiles to their already previously massive missile arsenals upon going off of the then current rates of production in each nation during the late 20-teens and early 2020s pertaining to each individual nation, China and Russia respectively. China, who by 2024 possessed 13,500 conventionally armed ballistic missiles of short, medium, and intermediate ranges, with another 500 ICBMs, which were armed with nuclear weapons, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, added another 8,000 short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles to their already massive 13,500 large arsenal of the time. Russia, not far behind, was adding 5,500 short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles to their own arsenal of what was then 9,500 such weapons. This replenishing many such weapons used during the Great European Proxy War of the early 2020s. As it pertained to the Chinese, their 3 brigades deployed to just this sector alone, the South Central Invasion Sector, were reinforced by several additional battalions each, these called up in order to operate the DF-2s, 3s, and 4s as mentioned earlier. These DF-2s, 3s, and 4 missile classes were previously retired to storage for use by these very reserve battalions. Moreover, the active battalion elements of the 3 brigades, as in the ordinary active units of these Strategic Missile Forces brigades, fired DF-21As, DF-15Bs and Cs, and DF-17s equipped with the DF-ZF hypersonic glide warheads, as mentioned. Within just the South Central Invasion Sector alone, the Chi-Coms fired 2,500 tactical ballistic missiles, with the Russians firing 1,400, along with Iran firing another 1,000. Russian missiles of the ballistic category, as mentioned before, were their Iskander tactical ballistic missiles, and for Iran, their Shahab-2s deployed for this invasion sector. As the invasion was set to jump off, the selected targets of both the tactical ballistic missiles and massive array of different cruise missiles, 40,000 alone being fired from 4,000 Club K/YJ-18C container disguised systems, mass-produced by China and Russia respectively, and hidden throughout the land of America, were primarily military in nature as it pertained to their targets, with some set on other critical sites as well, like specific key political or industrial sites specifically marked for destruction. However, some air, sea, and other types of ground-fired cruise missiles, also on TEL-based systems pertaining to the latter, would have their targeting data updated as the campaign would be underway and fluid and further developing as targets constantly changed. At sea, as the covering naval drills screening the movement of forces in Mexico and Canada to jumping off points for the external components relating to their movements, satellite blinding technology was also employed to hide such movements. This in case American ISR capabilities in the form of their satellites were shifted to focus upon these other specific locations. In addition, these American satellites would be destroyed by an array of Chinese and Russian hard-kill anti-sat weapons, such as the DN-2s and 3s, FK-2000s, and S-500, all of which were available in adequate numbers to eliminate all military and commercial satellites of the USA, all without posing any risk to Sino-Russian satellites due to the way satellites actually work and function versus the way that they're portrayed as the myth of floating so-called debris was one that could be debunked insofar as it related to destroyed satellites and so-called space junk. Moreover, a powerful cyber strike launched by the Sino-Russian coalition would, in tandem with the anti-satellite strikes, proverbially set America back to the near Stone Age, leaving only a scant few redundant systems, such as radio, only when not interfered with by enemy electronic warfare assets, which would be present during this invasion in huge numbers by land, air, and sea, relevant to the size of the overall scope and scale of the invasion. Only would some radar and radio work, and ever so briefly, and only in a scant few areas of the land as the invasion was underway. All of this as anything connected to the net, such as the power grid, plumbing and water treatment, internet and telecom, and even military networks were brought crashing down. Along with satellite-based data transfer technologies, GPS, communications, and more were also likewise eliminated parallel to the cyber strike, which eliminated the items earlier mentioned. As these two potent different strikes would commence, so too would the invasion as a whole itself. Scheduled to begin at midnight on the 4th of October, Chinese and Russian ISR assets, many based on Baidu and GLONASS networks, respectively, among others, together with drones and spy planes, including SIGINT and ELINT aircraft, even integrated with combat data link updates from frontline units as they advanced, created a combined data stream that was regulated by Chinese artificial intelligence, who had the top position as the AI world leader as it pertained to China, followed by Russia, who likewise now relied upon AI to streamline data processed on the modern fluid battlefield to make their respective militaries faster and deadlier as a result, along with their highly competent human leadership utilizing this new tool to the fullest extent possible, streamlining their decision-making processes, thus making their forces able to respond and act much faster and much more efficiently on the modern battlefield than ever before. As the forces lined up, readying their units and their logistics for a rapid advance deep into the USA, only stopping at designated CCP properties used as supply bases along the pre-designated key invasion routes, these properties having been purchased and steadily stocked with said supplies in the many millions of tons over the course of literal decades, These external forces moved forward most of the latter part of the day of October the 3rd, heading to their jumping off points. This, as the Trojan horse shock armies likewise had their phone chains activated, being recalled from anywhere they happened to be by a single word text, which was different unit to unit, pre-agreed upon within each local command. Therefore, upon returning to their CCP properties, they did accountability formations just prior to doing unit vehicle maintenance and logistical preparations. Before final formations were then held for briefing the troops on their individual units' specific area of operations, or AO, and key objectives within them. By midnight of the 4th of October, all Trojan units took to the roads as artillery strikes then began all throughout the land, in addition to waves of combat aircraft beginning to quickly violate American airspace from all sides. During this time, the first wave of military satellites were thus wiped out in the original wave of anti-satellite missiles fired with the tandem cyber strike. A second, third, and fourth volley of such anti-satellite missiles would be fired during the next hour and a half to finish off all of the remaining American commercial satellites, as the military satellites had been destroyed in the first volley. For many of the Trojan units, they would reach their initial objectives between the first and second hours of the invasion, timed therefore to coincide with the first Club K/YJ-18C strikes, having begun themselves at 2 a.m. and lasting to 10 a.m. on the first day, with highest priority targets to be hit first during the first wave of missiles fired. These missiles were fired in successive waves in order to maintain a shock and awe factor, keeping the people of the land continually seeing these cruise missiles airborne as long as possible, in addition to the aircraft and their air-fired and sea-fired cruise missiles from ships, in addition to TEL-fired cruise missiles, among the terrifying symphony of destruction by conventional artillery as well, both of the howitzer and rocket varieties, along with mortars and airdropped ordnances or fired ordnances of different types, besides just the cruise missiles they too were capable of delivering in many cases. All of this was coinciding with the Trojan shock forces breaking out in all directions inside of the land itself and within all corners of it. They were also doing this, as was also the crossing of the externals from Mexico being underway itself as well, and also there were the beach landing PLAN Marines along the Texas coast in support of the forces already inland, especially within the Houston and Port Arthur areas in particular, captured via the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade landing in Texas City, Texas / Galveston area, and also Port Arthur by the 6th Marine Brigade. Along with the PLAN Marines off coast in their Type 075 helicopter carriers and cargo ships as well, There were 4 Type O-39A Song-class submarines and 4 Type 055 stealth missile cruisers, also called the Renhai class, supported by a Type 903A supply/replenishment ship, all operating from bases in Cuba and Venezuela. The subs from Cuba specifically, and the rest operating out of Venezuela specifically. As the naval drills were underway, the cargo ships full of PLAN Marines sailed within American waters, awaiting the beginning of the invasion itself and subsequent arrival of the rest of the brigade on the 2 Type 075s and their protectors in the form of the 4 submarines and 4 cruisers, who had other missions of their own as well, such as pummeling targets inland in support of the entire invasion, as well as the operations along the coasts. In order to effectively, efficiently, and quickly land their entire brigades, capturing port facilities in both Texas City, Texas, and Port Arthur, Texas, was the first objective of each brigade's air assault and reconnaissance battalions. These 2 types of battalions being the lightest units within each PLAN Marine Brigade. In other words, essentially the fastest and easiest to get ashore first, with helo-borne infantry supported by armed recon helicopters, along with reconnaissance battalions landing via LCAC vessels with their light Lynx armored all-terrain vehicles, which were lighter and slightly smaller than up-armored Humvees. These 2 battalions of each brigade were to capture the ports and expand the perimeters of their bridgeheads, allowing for cranes at the ports to be used to rapidly and easily unload the remaining 3 heavier combined arms battalions, Air Defense Battalion, Artillery Battalion, Combat Support Battalion, and Service Support Battalions of each brigade, leaving the headquarters company aboard ship to direct their brigades on shore. Naval gunnery from 130mm guns aboard the cruisers and cruise missiles provided fire support when needed for the air assault battalions and recon battalions of each respective brigade, until the 2 brigades' own artillery battalions, 1 each, made it on shore upon being unloaded, along with the Air Assault Battalion's own armed reconnaissance helicopters, there since the beginning of the battle, flying back to the Type 075s only for fuel, maintenance, or to rearm, all before returning to the Marines AOs to support their operations. As these operations all throughout the South Central invasion sector were underway, the Americans found themselves essentially deaf, dumb, and blind as a whole due to their total loss of communications and ISR capabilities, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, thus rendering them completely incapable of organizing any sort of effective, coordinated response, lacking even the ability to obtain and act on any sort of actionable intelligence. In the dark, many civilians woke up, either realizing they lacked electricity and phone/internet, or much worse, hearing or being completely immersed in the destruction unfolding throughout the entire land itself. There were a decent number of defending American forces on the ground, but nowhere near the size of the invasion forces, who outnumbered them in the south central sector of the invasion by a factor of almost 7-1 in total personnel versus the combination of American military and armed reactionary civilians. Although, as time would pass, more and more armed civilians would join the fight, beginning as soon as the 4-day invasion phase would have come to its end, seeing occupation of the land formally set in. As there were very few air-to-air engagements during the entire invasion nationwide, only one noteworthy air-to-air engagement occurred, due to the Americans having overall relatively few combat aircraft that were airborne at the beginning of hostilities. Only a pair of FA-18s over the DFW Metroplex in Texas, flying near their base, the Naval Air Station in Fort Worth, both eliminated by ground-based air defense systems, HQ-12s to be exact, near their home installation in Fort Worth, all as the air-to-air combat occurred between Air Force F-16s, consisting of one squadron, and 2 squadrons of J-11Bs, with the J-11s firing PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles, with only one F-16 surviving, having tried to flee the battle space, only to be caught up to finally and shot down by a follow-up of 2 PL-12 missiles fired within 30 miles. This in order to allow the Mach 4 missile to reach its target on time, due to the lead time and the range of the fleeing F-16 ahead. While many American installations came under crippling missile, airdropped ordnance, artillery, and outright storming by enemy forces, at sea vessels of the Coast Guard and Navy patrolling the coast as a protective measure during the earlier Sino-Russian naval drills were likewise also torpedoed and struck by missiles blasted right out of the water, quite literally speaking. In some ways, these vessels were potential hazards, at least against aircraft in the area, and some vessels, although the anti-satellite, cyber, and electronic warfare systems took their toll on even these defenses. With no military networks and GPS, as well as EW, or electronic warfare, electromagnetic weapons, and jamming being used, made these vessels dead in the water and easier to destroy, as they could no longer defend themselves when even more primitive or close-in systems couldn't be deployed by these American vessels with any sort of success without power and or radar, depending upon which EW systems specifically were in use against these vessels. An Arleigh Burke-class Aegis ship patrolling off the coast near Houston/Galveston/Texas City, Texas area was hit by missile strikes, multiple missile strikes, along with 3 Coast Guard cutters, themselves by missiles, and even one was torpedoed, with the sea and air power of the Americans nullified immediately. It would be primarily up to the scattered, poorly organized, and increasingly leaderless American armed civilians, and to a certain extent, even the U.S. military, this due to a total lack of actionable intel and communications, save maybe immediately short range, insofar as it related to communications on the American side. Relating to the externals within the central sector of the invasion, there were 4 main invasion routes deep into the interior of the country, these being I-35, I-25, and I-10 which were in major usage by the external forces, with only their furthest western prong in Texas seeing a multitude or using a multitude of secondary state highways in use for their massive forces of the 1st through 6th Group Armies and Russian 41st Combined Arms Army with them, with the 7th through 13th Group Armies and PAP 7th, 5th, and 5th Brigades and 4th Artillery Regiment moving up I-35, and Group Armies 15 through 20 moving along coastal routes until reaching I-10 before heading eastbound into the southeastern United States. On the westernmost prong in New Mexico, the 14th Group Army and PAP 18th Armored Brigade raced north up I-25 to reinforce Trojans in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado states. Wave after wave of vehicles and troops crossed the border beneath the savagely destructive barrage of artillery, missiles, and air cover, encountering broken, scattered formations initially, consisting of National Guard and American regime paramilitary agencies, augmented by reactionary armed civilians jolted from their sleep by ubiquitous blasting and small arms fire, with the only active military presence within this sector in particular being those forces stationed at Fort Bliss within El Paso on the border, such as the 1st Armored Division of the U.S. Army, for example, among smaller elements still remaining at the post that weren't deployed elsewhere, including from deployed units leaving behind a rear detachment present on the installation. Pertaining to the National Guard in particular, every state was in the process of calling up their Guard forces to prepare them for state security missions and likely even federalizing along with elements of the reserves already called to active duty as well, or in the process of being called for such. Despite such measures, some states were much slower to mobilize than were others, with anywhere between 20 to 60% of their total forces available called up by the time of the invasion. As a national rough average, with Texas seeing 60% of their forces called up, Oklahoma 40%, and New Mexico only 1 battalion, or less than 20%. Reserve units were even smaller by call up, with very few activated in this region at the time of the invasion. As externals rapidly overcame the border areas in mere hours, they next raced inland as rapidly as possible. They were on a strict timetable to reach their objectives deep inland, being allocated very limited time in order to stop for fuel, ammunition, food, water, and at designated CCP supply properties, and if needed, also stopping for maintenance as well, with crew members alternating so that others could sleep while taking turns as drivers and gunners on combat vehicles, or others with turrets fitted with a crew serve weapon. This as the units raced ahead on their timetable. A machine gun being one type of crew serve weapon, for example, atop these vehicles as it related to the gunner's position. At a steady road speed of 35 miles per hour for these Group Army convoys of externals, many miles long in their enormous totality, were able to reach Wichita, Kansas within 46 hours, with 2 hours left to spare as it related to their given timetables. This, as the preset timeline for external forces, was to reach their destinations deep inland as reinforcements for the Trojan shock armies already there and fighting. They were given 2 days or 48 hours in order to arrive at their objectives. This even included the 6-hour long battle at the border around Laredo, Texas, along with the McAllen battle, which was 7 hours long, and the 14 hours worth of stop time for logistical resupply and or vehicle maintenance at the designated CCP properties. After all, the 783-mile distance could be completely covered within the allotted time at that speed, along with the aforementioned temporary detours. Truly a world record in terms of a rapid advance in enemy territory. Needless to say, the other 3 invasion prongs had in many cases much shorter distances to cover, such as that of the 14th Group Army and 18th PAP Armored Brigade, who essentially only had to traverse the state of New Mexico alone from south to north, upon aiding the Pakistani 14th Infantry Division with suppressing and destroying American defenses and forces in Fort Bliss along the border. All the while, as external forces were crossing the border in strength and crushing all resistance within those areas prior to advancing rapidly northwards, the Trojan shock armies throughout the land had struck outwardly from their CCP properties in all directions towards many multiple objectives, ranging from securing the main routes of invasion and supply to smashing key installations of the defending American forces to securing key infrastructure to be utilized in post-invasion colonization operations, among other objectives. Along with the aforementioned key objectives of the Trojan shock armies was also the total annihilation of all encountered armed civilian resistance, as well as capturing and securing all local regime facilities, food, fuel, and medical distribution or collection facilities, including but certainly not limited to farms and ranches, food warehouses and processing plants, refineries and fuel storage facilities, hospitals and medical supply depots, and much more. Oftentimes, these clusters of reactionary armed civilians mentioned grouped up upon spotting one another within relatively small areas, although they, upon doing so, were especially easy to spot by Sino-Russian coalition intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets from satellite all the way down to small drones operated down at the platoon or, in some cases, even squad levels. Therefore, were these armed civilian clusters simple to corral and herd into kill boxes by coalition units, or to direct artillery, air, mortar, and short-range rocket strikes upon, or sometimes even missile strikes, and even whole strategic air raids upon them. In addition to the myriad of conventional weapons and munitions that were in widespread usage throughout the invasion, there was also an array of experimental or newer weapons never before used en masse in warfare. At the very least, perhaps not yet utilized on such an enormous scale. Examples of such being robotics, whether armed or for carrying supplies into battle, or even for demolition being used by combat engineer forces. Also, FPV drones used to deliver death from above, as well as loitering munitions or kamikaze drones, which were primarily operated by both the Chinese and Russian forces in vast numbers. mostly by specialized elements dedicated to this role, typically found in headquarters units. Yet another new weapon deployed in combat was a newer and deadlier chemical weapon, being highly perilous amounts of a weaponized opioid called fent, often delivered by aerial drones fitted with specialized fans and slatted containers on board that would be open to blow out the highly toxic dust over a fairly large area. Chemical defense troops of the PLA, fully trained to protect other units and themselves from chemical and radiological attacks, were likewise able to safely handle and deliver these new and lethal weapons themselves, as they could safely handle any other weaponized chemical found and needing to be cleaned up or decontaminated from affected friendly units or areas. There was also directed energy weapons, and tungsten rods fired from orbiting so-called space weapons, which were held up by high-altitude balloons, but these were typically saved for very important targets like missile silo fields and other such targets of critical importance. Besides the reactionary armed civilian hostiles faced by the Sino-Russian coalition were the actual American regime security forces, ranging from the three different components of its military, being active, reserve, and National Guard forces, to its paramilitary agencies, like its alphabet agencies, and even local departments, with SWAT units armed and willing to resist within their own localities. It would be these various security forces in particular that would be hit the very hardest by the Sino-Russian coalition forces, who were literally after them as the highest priority targets within the scope of the whole invasion itself. With the total takedown of the entire grid, net, telecom, and even military networks, these defending forces were quite literally and metaphorically in the dark, confused, and lacked any actionable intel on the invaders, including their size, location, weapons, and capabilities or direction of the attacks, often not knowing anything until the last possible minute, with very few exceptions, such as when there were messengers passing through their areas in particular, giving advanced warnings, or dedicated scouts who just happened to survive to tell the story of what they had discovered while out on their missions. Overall, Sino-Russian coalition casualties would be relatively light within the initial 4-day invasion, constituting the actual invasion phase itself being the 4 days as mentioned, with the latter to come with later to come an insurgency costing far more casualties upon operations switching from high intensity to occupation and counterinsurgency, as by then the coalition will have lost its element of surprise due to attaining all the objectives of their invasion itself, now being highly visible throughout the land and on steady patrols and garrisoning operations throughout the then conquered America. However, prior to these occurrences, as in the occupation phase, the invasion would see the total shock and awe, confusion, and utter pandemonium and panic amongst the defending forces, as the coalition was hitting them full force with everything they had, all at once. Key in the concept of fourth-generation warfare was the total lack of any sort of front line whatsoever at all, seeing the blend of asymmetrical means with the conventional, marrying them together into the most dangerous form of warfare known to mankind. This was the case as the Trojans, instead of the externals, now took center stage, doing the lion's share of the dirty work of seizing the key objectives while also ensuring the defenders had absolutely no safe area whatsoever at all, from behind which what remained of America's already highly diminished industrial base and its fairly large population could mobilize and even become organized enough to become more dangerous than they were under the fourth generation doctrines of fighting the invasion. That would have been the case, as due to the vast size of the land, it would have taken the externals acting alone without the Trojans vastly more time due to no disruptions behind the front. They would comprise, if fighting using mere third generation doctrines similar to those of World War II, and onward during the last half century of war. However, the new additions of the high technology utilized, combined with both Trojans and externals, who themselves were now merely serving as reinforcements for the Trojan shock armies already within the land, was to guarantee a rapid and sound defeat of the defenders. This being due to the Trojans often beginning within mere miles of all their objectives, likewise guaranteed little to no time for the defending opposition forces to organize and become coordinated with any semblance of success, coupled with the fact of the tandem cyber and anti-satellite strikes, which most importantly crippled the ability for any real cohesive nationwide coordinated response to the invasion, leaving command decisions strictly at the most local of levels. Essentially, whomever was within visual or earshot, or at due to the rapidly attaining air superiority within the first hours of the first day, the make it or break it day, so to speak, guaranteed vehicle-based message spreading was to become ever more difficult as time passed, as anything that was non-coalition and spotted moving on the roads was fair game for pilots of aircraft and helos or armed drones and artillery strikes, or units in the area that were roving the countryside. Moreover, all-terrain vehicles, horses, and other forms of animal transport, and only well-camouflaged, forest canopy hidden pickup trucks serving as technicals for the civilians would end up becoming the only non-foot based transport amongst the civilian defending forces, and even rapidly disintegrating American military formations as well. Overall, by the end of the 4-day invasion, coalition casualties would number less than 10,000 KIAs throughout the entire land, not just the south central sector, but throughout the entire invasion. The coalition casualties would be less than 10,000 KIAs and just under 25,000 WIAs. Of course, being widely distributed among the 12.5 million strong invasion forces, thereby comprising only 0.0028% of the entire coalition's manpower, which was virtually nothing. Meanwhile, American casualties would be gruesomely larger, seeing some 30 million civilians KIA'd in the first 4 days due to being caught in the crossfire, hit by air, missile, artillery, and light artillery strikes, or outright massacred by evil paramilitary formations like the Chi-Com PAP, a brutally fanatical CCP Praetorian Guard-like unit, or by Iran's Pasdaran or IRGC, and yet others still to add to that list. Many of the paramilitary forces involved in the invasion typically fought by a different set of rules than did the units of the regular militaries involved, who themselves bent the Geneva Conventions slightly and humanitarian laws with it, but didn't quite outright break them, as they were generally far more humane when encountering unarmed civilians and refugees among that population. But it should be said that they didn't always concern themselves with what was called collateral damage, a euphemism for widespread destruction of life and property, as it was called, and even at certain times outright targeted whole civilian areas, whether due to real or suspected armed civilian resistance within said areas. Wounded civilians mostly perished due to little or no available adequate medical care, and are counted among that figure of 30 million deceased, itself being a large percentage of the population of the land, roughly being some 12% of its total population. American military and security forces casualties were 2.7 million KIAs out of the total 4 million belonging to all military branches and components, as well as paramilitary forces and their different agencies, all combined together. Again, many of the wounded perished and are counted within the number of KIAs, with the rest counted amongst the POW number of 500,000, with the rest of the total number of 4 million, some 800,000, remaining, melting away to fight another day, often leading or joining the myriad of insurgent/partisan groups that cropped up as soon as the invasion ceased formally and changed to an occupation. Oftentimes, these former security forces would also serve in a training capacity, becoming a sort of cadre of sorts at wilderness partisan outposts, teaching armed civilians who had enough wisdom to flee during the initial invasion phase itself, who for their part never got swept up with a desire to become reactionary, having the foresight to realize they were far too heavily outgunned by the phalanxes of armored vehicles and troops, supported by full air artillery, missile, drone, and sea support, and more. As occupation operations formally set in within the conquered areas, these forces would then become more widely distributed as it related to the occupation forces and far less concentrated like they were during the invasion, as operating and also operating at a different tempo and speed of operations, and thus becoming more completely dependent upon more widely spread logistical networks, all as the initial invasion logistics had by then been largely used up by the end of the invasion itself. Essentially, it took only 4 days to expend literal billions of total tonnage of ammunition and other supplies all combined, all of which having been diligently stockpiled in surrounding nations and on the CCP properties in America themselves. By invasion's end, what was left of these supplies, along with a new and steady stream of more en route from China and Russia predominantly, had to arrive for use against the partisan forces arising throughout the defeated nation. during the first day of the invasion itself, as the borders were overrun in mere hours and Trojans captured their first objectives as well. Many battles were simultaneously now underway as it related to the first day of the invasion, spanning not only throughout the entire nation itself, but even just within the large south central AO of the invasion as a whole. Each battle was uniquely distinct, with some lasting longer in duration than did others, although most were over within the first 36 to 48 hours, and some far earlier than even that. Perhaps the shortest of all these battles were those fought along the borders, and those also of Fort Hood, San Antonio, Austin, besides Shepherd Air Force Base and Fort Sill. Many of the urban battles, though, besides the two aforementioned of San Antonio and Austin, lasted between 48 and 72 hours, or essentially between the second and third day of the four-day invasion. When it related to the urban battles, control of the interstates was of paramount importance to the invaders, as many of these urban centers served as key road and rail junctions needing to be rapidly secured for the rapidly advancing external forces to be able to quickly pass through in order to get deep into the country to their final objectives. This all without being slowed down to engage in the fighting, or even being harassed in a way which could logistically hamper their advance. An example of this being the partial destruction of much weaker vehicles in these massively long convoys, which could lead to enormous traffic jams, such as those types of vehicles that pertain to supply and headquarters units in general, which were typically much weaker in terms of their armor protection and even armaments in many cases. Therefore, defeating any and all resistance adjacent to these interstate key invasion routes was an absolute must from the standpoint of objectives needing to be met by the local Trojan shock armies in each of these areas by these major invasion routes. As midnight struck and the Trojans left their CCP properties, along with the externals also crossing the borders simultaneously, first the border battles themselves will be explored in the next videos. The main four being El Paso and Fort Bliss, Laredo, and Penitas Ranches / Dolores West, which is just north of El Paso, and McAllen, Texas, down here in the southern tip of Texas, or also called the Lower Rio Grande Valley. As stated before, the externals began their border crossings, initial battles, and then rapid advances deep inland, while the Trojans were likewise already engaging in combat as well, and their respective exploits of the Trojans will also be explored in their own respective videos, as the largest invasion in human history was now underway at midnight, October the 4th. The next video will be the Lower Rio Grande Valley, McAllen, Texas battle. As that was occurring, all other battles were now occurring simultaneously. And only because one at a time can be covered, it must always be understood that all these battles began all at the exact same time, or roughly at the exact same time. Whether it was the Battle of Houston, the border battles all occurring along the borders, or whether it was the battle occurring in Albuquerque, Oklahoma City, Dallas, Fort Worth, Fort Hood, and all the rest that will be covered. All of these battles erupted on the 4th of October as missile battalions fired their ballistic and cruise missiles, as the 2nd Combined Arms Army's Rocket Brigade fired its tactical ballistic missiles, as enormous air armadas covered the entire nation and this sector, consisting of fighter squadrons, ground attack squadrons, consisting of these triangles, whether it consisted of a strategic bomber squadron of 8 strategic bombers each, which are these larger. Allies like Pakistan contributed these squadrons, or Iran contributing squadrons. This was an enormous battle and will be continued in the next video with the Battle of McAllen, Texas, and the lower Rio Grande Valley down here.